A struggling waitress sacrifices the only money keeping her family alive, just to feed two strangers her manager tried to throw out on Christmas Eve. Days later, they return, and what they reveal changes everything. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for the love and support. You're truly appreciated, and I'm so grateful to have you here with me. Also, let me tell you something funny. Someone actually bet that I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this year, and honestly, I want to prove them wrong. So if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and join the family. Reaching 1,000 subscribers is a very personal goal for me, and your support would mean the world to me. Thank you for believing in me and being part of this journey. And before you go, drop your name and location in the comments. I'd love to give you a special shout out in my next video introduction. Christmas Eve should have felt like magic. But for Grace Whitmore, it felt like drowning. The diner sparkled with festive cheer she couldn't afford to feel. Red and green garland draped along the windows, twinkling lights reflected off chrome countertops, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey filled the air. Families laughed in booths, children pressed sticky hands against frosted glass, and carolers hummed outside in the gentle snowfall. Grace moved through it all like a ghost. Her feet ached in worn-out shoes held together by duct tape and stubbornness. Her hands, raw, chapped, trembling slightly from exhaustion, carried trays of food she couldn't afford to eat herself. Her brown hair, pulled back in a messy ponytail, had long since given up any pretense of neatness. Dark circles framed her gentle eyes, eyes that had seen too much loss for 22 years. She wiped down table 7 for the third time, her mind elsewhere. The hospital bills sat unpaid on her kitchen counter. Her mother's medical debts, $47,000 and climbing, haunted her like a second shadow. Grace had made payment arrangements, picked up double shifts, sold everything that wasn't nailed down. But it was never enough. It was never enough. And then there was Danny, her little brother. 10 years old, too young to understand why Christmas this year meant no presents, no tree, no joy. Grace had promised him things would get better. She'd lied with a smile, the way their mother used to when the lights got shut off or the rent came due late. Grace was all Danny had left now. And she was failing him. The diner manager, Richard Kemper, barked orders from behind the counter, his sharp features twisted in permanent irritation. He was a man who measured success in receipts and saw people as profit margins. 50-something, balding, with cold eyes that calculated worth in dollars and dismissed anything that didn't contribute to his bottom line. Grace, table 4 needs refills. Move faster. We're not paying you to daydream. She nodded silently, grabbed the coffee pot, and returned to the rhythm of survival. Just get through tonight. Just make it to tomorrow. Just keep moving. The bell above the door chimed softly. Grace glanced up out of habit. 2 elderly figures stood in the doorway, hesitant and trembling against the cold. The man was tall but stooped, wearing a thin coat that had seen better decades. His hands shook, from age or cold or hunger, Grace couldn't tell. The woman beside him was smaller, silver-haired, her face lined with years of quiet dignity now shadowed by something that looked like shame. They looked lost, fragile, forgotten. The diner noise continued around them. Laughter, clinking glasses, Christmas music, but no one moved to help them. Customers glanced, then looked away. Some whispered. Some frowned. Grace watched the couple scan the room with hopeful, desperate eyes. Then Richard noticed them. His expression hardened immediately. Oh, hell no. He moved toward them with the efficiency of someone used to removing problems. Grace's stomach clenched. She knew that walk, that tone. "We're full tonight," Richard said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Private party reservations. You'll need to try somewhere else." It was a lie. Grace could see 3 empty booths from where she stood. The elderly man nodded slowly, apologetically. "We just need something warm. Anything. We can pay." "I said we're full." Richard's voice dropped to something colder. "Don't make this difficult." The woman touched her husband's arm gently, her eyes glistening. Grace saw her lips form silent words. "It's okay. Let's go." They turned toward the door, and Grace felt something crack inside her chest. She thought about her mother in those final hospital days, weak, vulnerable, afraid. She thought about Danny, small and trusting, believing his big sister could fix the world. She thought about all the times life had pushed her aside, made her feel invisible, worthless, unwanted. Her feet moved before her brain caught up. "Wait." The word came out softer than she intended, but in the sudden quiet of nearby tables, it carried. Richard's head snapped toward her. "Grace. Back to work." She ignored him. Grace approached the elderly couple, her heart hammering against her ribs. Up close, she could see the threadbare quality of their clothes, the way they held themselves with dignity despite obvious need. The man's eyes were kind but tired. The woman's hands trembled. "There's a booth in the back," Grace said gently. "It's quiet. You can sit there." Relief flooded the woman's face. "Thank you." "Oh, thank you, Grace." Richard's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "A word. Now." She led the couple to booth 12 first, settling them in with menus and water glasses. Their gratitude was almost painful to witness. Too much emotion for something so simple as being allowed to sit down. Grace returned to the counter where Richard waited, arms crossed, fury radiating off him like heat. "What the hell do you think you're doing? They're just cold. They're homeless. They have no money. This isn't a charity, Grace. This is a business. They said they can pay. They're liars." Richard leaned closer, his breath sharp with coffee and contempt. "You seat them, you serve them, you watch them, forget their wallet, and guess who pays for it? Out of your tips. Out of your wages." Grace's throat tightened. She couldn't afford that. She literally couldn't afford that. But she also couldn't walk away. "I'll cover it," she heard herself say. Richard blinked. "What?" "If they can't pay, I will. Just let them eat something warm. It's Christmas Eve." For a moment, Richard looked almost impressed by her stupidity. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Fine. Your funeral. But when you're short on rent, don't come crying to me." He walked away. Grace stood frozen, feeling the weight of what she'd just done settle over her shoulders like concrete. She had $127 in her bank account. Rent was due in 5 days. Danny needed new shoes. The electric bill was overdue. And she just promised to pay for 2 strangers who might order $30, $40, maybe $50 worth of food. What am I doing? But she moved anyway. Grace approached booth 12 with her order pad, forcing her best smile. The one she gave customers who left good tips, the one that hid everything breaking underneath. "What can I get for you tonight?" The elderly man studied the menu with careful consideration, as if each item required deep thought. His wife touched his hand gently. "The soup special," the man said finally. "And coffee." 2 coffees. Grace wrote it down. "That's all." They nodded. She wanted to tell them to order more. To get the roast turkey, the mashed potatoes, the pie. To eat until they were full and warm and satisfied. But she also knew what generosity cost. "Coming right up," she said softly. Grace put the order in, her hands shaking slightly. She avoided Richard's knowing glare. She delivered food to other tables on autopilot, her mind running calculations she didn't want to finish. When the soup was ready, 2 bowls of hearty vegetable stew with fresh bread, she carried it to booth 12 like she was handling something sacred. The couple looked at the steaming bowls with an expression Grace would remember for the rest of her life. Not greed. Not entitlement. Gratitude. Pure, overwhelming, humbling gratitude. They ate slowly, savoring each bite. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing at Grace with soft smiles. When they finished, the man carefully folded his napkin and the woman straightened the table as if trying to leave it better than they found it. Grace approached with the check. Her heart pounded. "Please have money. Please don't let me be wrong about this." The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out nothing. He checked another pocket. Then another. Grace watched his face change, embarrassment flooding in, shame coloring his weathered cheeks. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. I was certain I had." His wife's eyes filled with tears. Grace felt her own future crumbling. $18.50. The meal cost $18.50. She had planned to use her tips tonight to buy Danny a small gift. Nothing big, maybe a used book or a toy from the thrift store. Something so he didn't wake up Christmas morning with nothing. Now that was gone. But looking at this couple, at their humiliation, their quiet devastation, Grace couldn't add to their pain. "It's okay," she said softly. "No, it's not," the man began. "It's Christmas Eve." Grace smiled, and this time it wasn't forced. "Consider it a gift." She pulled out her own wallet, thin, nearly empty, and placed a $20 bill on the table. She picked up the check, marked it paid, and walked away before they could protest. Before she could change her mind. Behind the counter, Richard smirked. "Sucker." Grace said nothing. The elderly couple stood slowly, gathering their coats. As they passed Grace on their way to the door, the woman stopped and took both of Grace's hands in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Bless you," she whispered, her eyes searching Grace's face as if memorizing it. "You have no idea. Truly bless you." Then they were gone. The bell chimed. The door closed. The diner returned to its festive chaos. And Grace stood in the middle of it all, feeling the weight of kindness like stones in her pockets. She had $107 left now. Rent wouldn't be paid on time. Danny's shoes would have to wait. The electric company would send another warning. But somewhere out in the cold Christmas night, two people were warmer than they'd been before. Grace didn't know if that made her brave or foolish. She only knew she couldn't have lived with herself if she'd done nothing. As she wiped down tables for the rest of her shift, exhaustion pulling at her bones, Grace wondered if kindness was supposed to hurt this much. If doing the right thing was always this costly. And whether anyone, anywhere, ever noticed when people like her chose compassion over survival. If she helps them, she may break her life. If she turns away, something inside her may break forever. Tonight, Grace had made her choice. Now she would have to live with it. The rest of Grace's shift passed in a fog of noise and numbness. She refilled coffee cups without seeing faces. She cleared tables without hearing conversations. The Christmas music that had felt oppressive before now sounded distant, muffled, like she was underwater and the world was happening somewhere above her. Her body moved through the familiar motions. Smile, take orders, deliver food, collect tips, but her mind kept circling back to that $20 bill. To the couple's faces. To the choice she'd made. $107 left. The number played on repeat, a quiet drumbeat of anxiety she couldn't silence. Richard passed her twice without speaking, which was somehow worse than his earlier contempt. His silence felt like judgment held in reserve, ammunition he was saving for later. Grace could feel his eyes tracking her movements, calculating, waiting for her to crack. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. At 11:47 p.m., the last customers finally left. Grace locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and began the closing routine she could perform in her sleep. Wipe down tables. Stack chairs. Sweep floors. Count the register. Her tips sat in a small pile on the counter. $43.75. On a normal Christmas Eve, she might have made twice that. But tonight had been strange. The tension with Richard, the distraction, the way she'd avoided eye contact with customers after the elderly couple left. People sensed disconnection. They tipped accordingly. Grace folded the bills carefully and tucked them into her apron pocket. Combined with what was left in her bank account, she had $150.75 total. Rent was $650. The math didn't work. It had never worked. But tonight, somehow, it felt more impossible than usual. Richard emerged from the back office, already wearing his coat. He paused beside her, studying her with an expression that might have been curiosity if he were capable of genuine interest in another person's well-being. "You know what your problem is, Grace?" She didn't answer. Didn't look up from wiping the counter. "You think the world rewards nice people." He said it like he was explaining something to a child. It doesn't. The world eats nice people alive and picks its teeth with their bones. Grace kept wiping. Those two you helped tonight? They're probably laughing about it right now. That stupid girl paid for our meal. That's what you are to them. A mark. A sucker. Maybe, Grace said quietly. Definitely. Richard pulled his keys from his pocket. You want to survive in this world? You learn to look out for yourself. Because nobody else will. He left without saying goodnight. Grace finished closing alone, the silence of the empty diner pressing against her ears. When everything was clean and locked, she pulled on her threadbare coat, the one with the broken zipper she kept meaning to fix, and stepped out into the December cold. The snow had stopped, leaving the streets covered in pristine white that glowed under streetlights. Christmas decorations still sparkled in shop windows. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of church bells marking midnight. Christmas Day had arrived. Grace walked home slowly, her feet aching with every step. The cold bit through her inadequate coat, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too busy running calculations, playing out scenarios, trying to find solutions that didn't exist. Maybe I can pick up extra shifts next week. Maybe the landlord will accept a partial payment. Maybe Danny won't notice if Christmas is late this year. The days after Christmas blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and mounting dread. Richard made good on his unspoken threat. Grace's schedule was cut, fewer shifts, worse hours, the slots that came with minimal tips. He assigned her the back sections, the cleaning duties, the tasks that kept her away from customers who might show generosity. Business is slow after the holidays, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nothing personal. Everything was personal. Grace watched her coworkers get the good shifts, the prime tables, the opportunities she desperately needed. She said nothing. Protesting would only make things worse. The bills arrived with mechanical precision. A red envelope from the electric company. Final notice. A letter from the landlord. Payment overdue. Late fees applied. A statement from the hospital billing department. $47,000 became $47,000 plus interest, plus administrative fees, plus the relentless accumulation of debt that would follow her like a shadow for decades. Grace spread them across the kitchen table one evening after Danny had gone to bed, staring at numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all the sense they made. She had $173 in her bank account. The math didn't just fail to work. It laughed at her for trying. By the third day after Christmas, the food situation became critical. Grace stood in front of the open refrigerator, nearly empty except for condiments, half a carton of eggs, and some wilting vegetables, and felt panic claw at her throat. Danny needed to eat. Growing boys needed nutrition, regular meals, the kind of stability her mother had somehow always managed to provide even when they'd had nothing. Grace couldn't even manage that. She made eggs stretch for 2 meals. She watered down the orange juice. She told Danny she wasn't hungry while her stomach gnawed at itself. At work, she started eating the leftover toast customers didn't finish, scraping plates quickly before anyone could see. She wasn't proud of it, but pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Richard noticed everything with his calculating eyes but said nothing. His silence was its own form of cruelty. A week passed. Then another. The elderly couple never returned. Grace hadn't expected them to, why would they? But some small, foolish part of her had hoped. Hoped they might come back just to say hello. To acknowledge what she'd done. To prove that kindness hadn't disappeared into a void without echo. But there was nothing. No word. No sign. No magical reward for doing the right thing. Just the grinding, relentless pressure of a life that didn't care about moral choices. Grace worked her reduced shifts. She avoided eye contact with Richard. She smiled at customers who barely saw her. She went home to an apartment that grew colder as the heating continued to fail. She watched Danny try to be brave while his shoes fell apart and his stomach rumbled. And slowly, quietly, something inside her began to break. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after Christmas Eve. Grace was wiping down tables in the empty diner, the post-lunch lull that left her alone with her thoughts, which was the last place she wanted to be. Her hands moved mechanically across the laminate surface, the motion so familiar it required no thought. Her mind wandered to dangerous places. Did I do the right thing? The question had been whispering in the background for days, growing louder with each unpaid bill, each hungry night, each moment she watched Danny pretend everything was fine. She'd given away money she couldn't spare to people she didn't know. Money that could have bought Danny new shoes. Money that could have kept the electricity on. Money that represented hours of her life, her aching feet, her exhausted body, her sacrifice. For what? For two strangers who'd vanished without a trace, leaving her drowning in consequences they'd never witness. Where was God in this? Where was fate? Where was the universe that supposedly rewarded good people? Grace's hands stilled on the table. Her vision blurred. She realized, with distant surprise, that she was crying, silent tears tracking down her cheeks while she stood alone in an empty diner, holding a dirty rag, wondering if kindness was just another word for foolishness. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe the world did eat nice people alive. Maybe she'd been stupid to think that helping someone could ever mean anything beyond the immediate moment. Maybe she was invisible after all, just another struggling girl whose small acts of compassion disappeared like raindrops in an ocean, making no difference, changing nothing, mattering to no one. Grace wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. Stop it. Pull yourself together. You don't have time to fall apart. But the despair sat heavy in her chest, a weight that made breathing difficult. She turned back to her tables, ready to sink back into the numbing routine. The bell above the door chimed. Grace glanced up automatically, preparing her waitress smile. Then froze. The atmosphere in the diner shifted so dramatically it felt physical, like the air pressure had changed, like the temperature had dropped, like reality had tilted slightly on its axis. Everything went quiet. Conversations at the few occupied tables faded. Silverware stopped clinking. Even Richard looked up from behind the counter, his perpetual scowl morphing into something approaching curiosity. Two figures stood in the doorway. The same elderly couple from Christmas Eve, but not the same at all. The man stood tall now, no stooping, no fragility. He wore an immaculate charcoal coat that spoke of wealth without shouting it. His posture radiated quiet authority, the kind of presence that commanded rooms without effort. His eyes, previously tired and desperate, now held sharp intelligence and something else Grace couldn't quite name. The woman beside him had transformed even more dramatically. Her silver hair was styled elegantly. She wore a deep burgundy coat over what looked like designer clothing. But more than the clothes, it was her bearing, graceful, confident, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with self-possession. They looked like people who owned buildings, ran companies, shaped the world with decisions made in boardrooms most people would never see. They looked like billionaires. Grace's mind struggled to reconcile these elegant strangers with the shivering, desperate couple she'd fed. That can't be them. It can't be. But it was. Richard moved first, his business instincts overriding his confusion. He rushed around the counter with his most obsequious smile, the one he reserved for customers who looked like they could afford to tip well. Good afternoon. Welcome. Let me get you our best table. The man raised one hand slightly. The gesture was minimal, but Richard stopped mid-sentence as if he'd hit an invisible wall. Thank you, no, the man said. His voice was deep, cultured, and carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We're looking for someone specific. The woman's eyes scanned the diner with purpose. They landed on Grace. And stayed there. We're looking for Grace, the woman said softly, though her voice carried through the silent diner. Grace Whitmore. Every head turned. Grace felt the weight of a dozen stares, felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the world tilting beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. This didn't happen in real life. Richard's expression cycled through confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been fear. He looked at Grace, then at the couple, calculating angles he didn't yet understand. Grace, the man said gently, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. Might we have a moment of your time? Grace's legs moved without consulting her brain. She walked toward them in a daze, her hands trembling, her mind racing through impossibilities. Why are they here? What do they want? Did I do something wrong? Up close, The transformation was even more startling. These were not the same people. And yet, their eyes, kind, penetrating, those were the same. "Hello," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hello, dear," the woman said with a smile that held warmth and something deeper. "Recognition. Respect. We've been looking forward to seeing you again. Might we speak somewhere private?" Richard hovered nearby, trying to insert himself into the conversation. "Perhaps my office." "No," the man said simply. His gaze never left Grace. "Just Grace. If she's willing." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. The woman gestured toward the quiet booth in the back, booth 12, where Grace had seated them on Christmas Eve. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As Grace followed them, her hands trembling at her sides, she felt the weight of every eye in the diner tracking her movement. She felt Richard's confusion. She felt the shift in reality that was happening, though she didn't yet understand what it meant. The couple slid into the booth. Grace stood at the edge, her legs suddenly refusing to hold her. "Please sit," the man said gently. Grace sat. The woman reached across the table and took both of Grace's hands in hers, just as she had on Christmas Eve, but now the grip felt different. Stronger. More purposeful. "Grace," she said softly, her eyes glistening with emotion. "We need to tell you something. Something important. About who we are, and why we came to your diner that night." Grace's heart stopped. The world held its breath. And everything was about to change. Grace's hands trembled in the woman's gentle grip. The diner had gone so quiet she could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the distant tick of the wall clock, her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The man folded his hands on the table, his expression serious but kind. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "My name is Thomas Hargrave," he said. "This is my wife, Eleanor. And we owe you an explanation." Grace's mind snagged on the name. Hargrave. She'd heard it before, somewhere in the background noise of the world, attached to buildings or foundations or... "We weren't honest with you on Christmas Eve," Eleanor continued softly. "Not about who we are. Not about why we came here." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "We weren't poor, Grace. We weren't desperate. We weren't what we appeared to be." The words landed like physical blows. Grace's breath caught. "We're philanthropists," Eleanor explained, her eyes never leaving Grace's face. "For the past 20 years, we've walked through cities, through towns, through places where people have forgotten what it means to see each other. We dress as the world's forgotten. We become invisible. And we watch. We watch how people treat those they believe have nothing to offer them," Thomas said. "How they respond when compassion costs something. When kindness requires sacrifice." Grace's mind reeled. "You were testing people?" "Testing hearts," Eleanor corrected gently. "Looking for something the world tells us doesn't exist anymore. Genuine compassion that expects nothing in return." "We've done this in hundreds of cities," Thomas said. "Hundreds of restaurants, stores, public spaces. And Grace." His voice softened. "Most people fail. Not because they're evil, but because they're tired or afraid, or have been taught that survival means looking away." Grace felt tears building behind her eyes. "But You didn't look away," Eleanor said, squeezing Grace's hands. "Even when it cost you. Even when your manager threatened you. Even when you knew that helping us would hurt you financially. You paid for our meal with money you desperately needed," Thomas said. "We watched you do the mental math. We saw the fear in your eyes. We saw what that choice cost you." Grace's vision blurred. "I don't understand. Why would you do that? Why would you trick people?" "Because we're looking for something real," Eleanor said. "In a world full of performed charity and public virtue, we're searching for the people who choose kindness when no one is watching. When there's no reward, no recognition, no benefit. We're looking for people like you," Thomas said simply. The tears Grace had been holding back spilled over. She pulled her hands free to cover her face, her shoulders shaking with the force of emotions she couldn't name. Shock, relief, confusion, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Grace," Eleanor said softly. "Look at me, dear." Grace lowered her hands slowly, meeting the older woman's gaze. What you did that night wasn't small. It wasn't meaningless. It was extraordinary. And we want to honor it. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio. He opened it carefully, extracting several documents that he laid on the table between them. Your mother's medical debt, he said, pointing to the first document. $47,000. It's been paid in full. The hospital has been notified. You'll receive confirmation within 24 hours. Grace stared at the paper, the words not processing. What? Your rent, Eleanor continued, pointing to another document. 6 months paid in advance, with an option to extend or relocate to better housing if you choose. Your brother Daniel's medical care, Thomas added. We've established a trust fund for his health care, education, and general welfare through age 25. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. A sound escaped her, half sob, half gasp, as the reality crashed over her in waves. Your education, Eleanor said gently. We've arranged a scholarship to the community college, or university, if you prefer, for any field of study you choose. Full tuition, books, living expenses. And finally, Thomas said, his voice warm, we'd like to offer you a position within our foundation. Part-time while you study, full-time after if you're interested. Working with us to find and support others who demonstrate the kind of compassion you showed us. Grace couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the enormity of what they were saying. This is... Her voice broke. This can't be real. It's very real, Eleanor assured her. And Grace, this isn't charity. This isn't pity. This is recognition. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. Do you know how rare you are? In a world that teaches people to protect themselves first, you chose strangers. In a moment when you had every reason to turn away, you moved forward. You saw us, truly saw us, when everyone else looked through us like we were ghosts. You helped because kindness lives in you, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. Not because someone was watching. Not because you expected anything. But because your heart wouldn't allow you to walk away from suffering. Grace shook her head, tears streaming freely now. I'm not special. I couldn't, my mother always said. Your mother raised someone extraordinary, Thomas said firmly. And we believe she would be incredibly proud of who you've become. The mention of her mother broke something loose in Grace's chest. She sobbed openly now, years of exhaustion and fear and desperate hope pouring out in waves she couldn't control. Eleanor moved around the booth to sit beside her, pulling Grace into an embrace. The older woman held her while she cried, stroking her hair, murmuring soft reassurances. It's okay, dear. Let it out. You've been so strong for so long. You're allowed to feel this. Around them, the diner had become a tableau of stunned witnesses. Customers sat frozen, forks suspended halfway to mouths. The cook had emerged from the kitchen, watching with wide eyes. And Richard stood behind the counter, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked like the dawning realization that he'd made a terrible miscalculation. When Grace's sobs finally subsided into shaky breaths, Eleanor gently guided her back to sitting upright. Thomas offered her a clean handkerchief, actual cloth, monogrammed, the kind of thing Grace had only seen in movies. I don't know what to say, Grace whispered, dabbing at her eyes. You don't have to say anything, Eleanor said. But there is one thing we need you to understand. Thomas nodded. This isn't a rescue. This isn't a swooping in to save you. You were already saving yourself, working multiple shifts, caring for your brother, maintaining your integrity in a world that punishes it. You were already strong. Already worthy. Already enough. We're simply removing obstacles that shouldn't have been there in the first place, Eleanor said. Giving you the breathing room to become everything you're capable of being. Grace looked down at the documents on the table, official letters, bank statements, legal documents that represented a future she'd never allowed herself to imagine. Why me? She whispered. Out of everyone you've tested, why choose to help me? Thomas and Eleanor exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of partnership. Because, Thomas said slowly, You reminded us why we started this work in the first place. To find proof that humanity still exists. That compassion isn't extinct. That people like you, people with nothing to spare who give anyway, are still out there, fighting to keep the world's heart beating. Eleanor smiled through her own tears. You gave us hope, Grace. We wanted to return the favor. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Thomas and Eleanor explained logistics, phone numbers, contact information for their attorneys and foundation managers, instructions for accessing the various funds and resources they'd established. Grace nodded through it all, her mind still struggling to accept that this was real, that her life had just fundamentally changed, that the weight she'd been carrying for so long was simply gone. When they finally stood to leave, Eleanor embraced Grace one more time. We'll be in touch, she said warmly. But Grace, take a moment to breathe, to rest, to feel what it's like when the pressure finally lifts. And remember, Thomas added, shaking her hand with both of his, you earned this. Not through that one act, but through every choice you've made to remain kind in a world that tries to harden us all. They turned to leave, moving with the quiet dignity Grace now recognized as their true nature. At the door, Thomas paused and looked back at Richard, who still stood frozen behind the counter. You should know, Thomas said, his voice carrying through the silent diner, we'll be writing about this experience. The Foundation publishes stories about the remarkable people we meet. Grace's compassion will be celebrated, but we'll also be honest about the environment that tested her, including management that punished rather than supported that compassion. Richard's face went pale. Thomas smiled, a smile that held no warmth. Just something to consider for the future. Then they were gone, the bell chiming softly behind them. The diner remained silent for 3 full heartbeats. Then erupted. Customers at nearby tables stood, approaching Grace with congratulations and tearful smiles. The cook rushed out to hug her. Even the other waitresses, who'd barely spoken to her in weeks, suddenly wanted to celebrate her good fortune. Grace accepted it all in a daze, still not quite believing it was real. Richard disappeared into his office without a word. Grace stood at her apartment window, a different apartment now, one with heating that worked and windows that didn't rattle, watching spring snow fall gently over the city. Life hadn't transformed into a fairy tale overnight. She still worked, though now at the Foundation's office, learning the systems that would eventually help others the way she'd been helped. She still studied, taking evening classes at the community college, slowly building toward a degree in social work. But the crushing weight was gone. Danny had new shoes, new clothes, regular meals that didn't require her to sacrifice her own hunger. He laughed more now, his eyes bright with the kind of childhood joy Grace had worried he'd lost forever. The medical bills were paid. The debt collectors had stopped calling. She could breathe without calculating costs, sleep without nightmares about homelessness, exist without the constant terror of survival. Grace had learned that kindness hadn't been foolish after all. It had simply been deferred. She thought often about that Christmas Eve, about the choice she'd made when she'd had every reason to walk away. She wondered who she would have become if she'd chosen differently. If she'd let fear and self-preservation win. Someone harder, probably. Someone smaller. The person she was now, studying, working, slowly building a life defined by compassion rather than desperation, existed because she'd chosen to see 2 strangers as human when the world told her they were worthless. Her phone buzzed. A text from Eleanor, working on our spring gala. Would love for you to speak about your experience if you're comfortable. No pressure. We're proud of you regardless. Grace smiled and typed back, I'd be honored. The Foundation's annual humanitarian gala filled a hotel ballroom with elegant gowns, expensive suits, and the kind of wealth that could change lives with a signature. Grace stood backstage, smoothing down her simple black dress, the nicest thing she owned, purchased from a thrift store and tailored with her own hands. She'd graduated from community college last month, started her master's program, continued her work at the Foundation, which had become less of a job and more of a calling. Danny, now 12, sat in the audience beside Eleanor, grinning up at his big sister with pure pride. When Grace stepped onto the stage, she didn't feel nervous. She felt ready. She told them about Christmas Eve. About being broke and exhausted and choosing kindness anyway. About not knowing that choice would echo forward into a changed life. "I didn't help because I was special," Grace said, her voice steady. "I helped because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. And I want everyone here to understand that capacity for compassion exists in all of us. It just needs to be honored instead of punished, supported instead of dismissed." In the back row, Thomas and Eleanor sat holding hands, watching with quiet satisfaction. They weren't heroes in this story. They were simply witnesses. Witnesses to proof that humanity still existed. That kindness still mattered. That sometimes, when life finally noticed goodness, it didn't just say thank you. It amplified it. Grace finished her speech to standing ovation, but what she remembered most was the young waitress who approached her afterward, eyes tired, hands worn, struggling with the same burdens Grace had once carried. "Your story gave me hope," the girl whispered. Grace took her hands gently. "Then let me give you something else." And the cycle continued. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.